All right, welcome to all of our guests, special guests and regularly attending guests today. This is the second installment in a lecture series this semester on the broad theme of solidarity. An issue I think that is always important, but in these particular times, perhaps more important than ever. Our special guest today is Stephen Schneck, and I'll introduce him in a couple of different phases. First of all, he is a public servant, and he has fulfilled a number of roles in recent years serving our country. He has been a White House advisor on Catholic issues. He's actually served on the White House Advisory Council for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Presently, he is the chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Very important agency that, as of today, is still functioning at this point, that fulfills a role monitoring religious freedom issues around the world. But in addition to being a public servant, Steve Schneck, if you look at his Wikipedia page, is named as an American Catholic activist. What have been some of his, broadly speaking, activist roles? He was, for some years, and as some of our guests today could tell you, the executive director of the Franciscan Action Network. He has served on a variety of different boards with Catholic organizations, life organizations, death penalty organizations like the Catholic Mobilizing Network, the Catholic Climate Covenant. And in addition to those capacities, sometimes behind the scenes, he's also a media analyst who's appeared and published opinion pieces in national media. So he's out there on a range of issues. But alongside all of that, he has a pre-life here at Catholic University. And that's why so many people are glad to see him here today. He was on our faculty for over 30 years. I know you can't believe that when you look at him, and retiring in 2018. He is a political philosopher by training. He studied and received his doctorate at Notre Dame University. He was the chair of the politics department here for a number of years. He also served as dean of NCSSS, the School of Social Work. He was even a dean in the College of Arts and Sciences at one point. And I know him best through his work as the founding director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies, which for many years, especially when Steve was here, was one of the most vibrant interdisciplinary offices and institutions on campus. We've asked Steve to come speak here today on this topic very broadly of solidarity in his capacity as a scholar and political philosopher. And in that capacity, he has published well-received books and articles on a number of topics and important thinkers, including Alexis de Tocqueville, Max Scheler, the very influential German scholar of the last century, who was a particularly large influence on the thought and writings of Pope John Paul II, on the theme, for example, of personalism. Steve has also written about Michel Foucault and published a Festschrift, as it's known, a book in honor of his Doktorvater, his mentor in his field of political philosophy, Fred Dallmeyer, called Fred Dallmeyer's Cosmopolitical Vision. So you see some different snippets of the person. We're going to hear Dr. Schneck talk today about community, solidarity, and religious freedom. Please welcome him.
Most astonishing introduction I think that I have ever had. I hope I live up to about half of that. Well, what a lovely day. I'm really pleased to see that you all were willing to forego this beautiful weather and come listen to a dry talk. It is a pleasure to be back. I'd like to explain this. Grateful to the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies and to the McLean Center for the Study of Culture and Values for the invitation to come and talk with them today. Thinking, and I see who in the back from the center, thinking about Father McLean, and I've been thinking about Father McLean actually quite a bit over the last couple of years, especially when I find myself in unusual places abroad. Back in the day, I journeyed with Father McLean to many unusual places behind the Iron Curtain and in the Middle East and so forth. A wonderful, wonderful scholar and priest. May he rest in peace. As Bill just mentioned, I've been asked to speak this afternoon about solidarity. I'm going to speak about solidarity not only in my capacity as a political philosopher, which is a little bit long in the tooth right at the moment, but also in my capacity as chair. Solidarity, when it's usually tossed about as a term, is conceived as a quality of someone, even as illuminated, people themselves, self-interests, in order to merge into some oneness. Actually, hard to push back. Because I believe the church is teaching solidarity. The church's teaching on solidarity, rightly understood, is achievable only as a kind of pluralism, in which certain a priori rights are recognized, kind of rights that protect pluralism. While I will ultimately try to offer a very tentative theoretical analysis, I am primarily, come on in. As I said, while I will ultimately try to offer a bit of a theoretical analysis, I have to say that I'm primarily driven by what I've seen empirically. What I've seen empirically around the world from my work with the Commission. In this regard, I particularly want to frame today's discussion as an exploration of solidarity with my observation that religious nationalism is opposed to solidarity. Religious nationalism. As chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom or Youth Services, past few years it's been my responsibility to witness the global epidemic, violence, persecution, calculated discrimination directed at people because of what they believe or because of what they don't believe. What I've seen documented, what I've witnessed personally, should give pause to any who doubt the value of liberal democracy's political order based on human rights. In particular, it's become clear from my observations that rights of conscience, of belief, of faith, and religion are not only essential for human life and dignity, they are critical rights, even foundational rights for pluralism, solidarity, light of the common good, the kind of solidarity that's so necessary for liberal democracy itself. And this is probably a good time for me to say, especially since it's going to be on YouTube apparently, that I'm speaking today in my private capacity. These are my own thoughts and these are my own analyses. I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I'm speaking just as Steve. That said, I was appointed to the commission by President Biden in the spring of 2022, and almost immediately, I was sent on a mission to assess the rights of refugees from Myanmar. Refugees suffer under brutal conditions in both sanctioned and unsanctioned refugee camps that are in places like Bangladesh, Thailand, India, and Malaysia. My mission was twofold: to Christian undocumented refugee communities in Malaysia and to Muslim Rohingya camps in Bangladesh. Myanmar's refugees are victims of horrific religious persecution. A persecution from, this may surprise you, from a militant Buddhist nationalist. A religious nationalism that metastasized in Myanmar over the last decade, even seizing the government by coup in February of 2021. Pushed by my commission, the United States government has labeled this persecution a genocide, which speaks, I think, not only to the military violence that the Myanmar regime has used against its victims, like those Christians and Muslims that I just mentioned, but also to the government's systematic efforts to eliminate any religious culture other than Buddhism. In fact, it was amidst a very emotional stay at a Rohingya refugee camp near a place called Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh that the clear linkage in my mind, the clear linkage between religious nationalism and this kind of persecution became obvious to me. It was there that I became convinced as well that religious nationalism is fundamentally contrary to solidarity. Now, how could this be so, you might ask? Wouldn't you think that enforcing a single religion on a country would actually lead to greater solidarity? Solidarity is certainly what Catholic integralists like Adrian Vermeule and many Catholic so-called post-liberals imagine would result from the imposition of a Catholic nation. But would it really be solidarity? Can religious nationalism actually foster solidarity? From the real world evidence that I've observed, where religious nationalism actually is ascending, the answer is a clear no. Let me give you two examples. Two countries where religious nationalism is in the process of being implemented by the state. Hindu nationalism in India and Christian nationalism in Hungary. Let me begin with India. In Hindi, the religious nationalism of India is called Hindutva. Hindutva is a weaponizing of religion to support the national movement that has empowered the BJP party of Prime Minister Modi and provided cover for violent Hindu militant groups like RSS. Far from engendering solidarity in India, Hindutva has opened up massive divisions in Indian society. Going far beyond political polarization, these fomented divisions have spurred sectarian and communal violence. Let me give you some historical context. In 1992, Hindu mobs, intent on constructing a temple to the god Ram on the site, purposely destroyed the famed Babri Mosque in Ayodhya, which prompted years of sectarian violence, leaving thousands, mostly Muslims, dead. The razing of that mosque became a template for what has come to be called bulldozer justice in India, a term used to justify everything from Hindu lynching of minority religious men on spurious charges, the beating of interfaith couples, and the demolishing of non-Hindu homes by government authorities. Now fast forward to current times. In 2023, Prime Minister Modi and his BJP party led celebrations to inaugurate an enormous, newly constructed temple to the god Ram on the site of that razed Babri Mosque. That, folks, is false. Modi's Hindutva government, as well as BJP-controlled state and local governments in India, have implemented religiously discriminatory policy, passing laws that target religious conversion, interfaith relationships, the wearing of hijabs, and similar laws that negatively impact non-Hindu religions. These laws target Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and other minority religions, as well as the practices of indigenous peoples and tribes in the country. Beyond the government's discriminatory actions and policies, however, there is also intentional governmental inaction. Under Hindutva, India consistently fails to prosecute or hold accountable Hindu vigilante mobs that terrorize and attack minority religious communities. With this inaction in the last few years, destruction of property, including places of worship in predominantly Muslim and Christian neighborhoods, has risen dramatically. Muslim neighborhoods have in fact been destroyed. Several Muslim madrasas were razed after government officials in Assam called for their destruction. Instances of sexual violence against Muslim women is too often not prosecuted, and even in some cases where those incidents have been broadcast on social media. Similarly, Hindu nationalists bulldozed a Catholic center in Mangalore and attacked, looted, and destroyed the homes of hundreds of Christians for their refusal to convert to Hinduism. In 2023, just 2 years ago, more than 200 Christian churches were destroyed in Manipur, both Protestant and Catholic, as well as 2 synagogues. The government shows little interest in prosecuting those involved in this fight. Government officials often employ disinformation and hate speech on social media platforms against religious minorities and transnationally, and you're probably aware of this. The Indian government has been indicated in the assassination of a Sikh leader in Canada and an assassination plot against another Sikh leader in New Jersey. So, needless to say, Hindu nationalism in India, Hindutva, has not resulted in solidarity. Just the reverse. Religious nationalism there has led to bitter and increasingly violent internal division, entrenching disunity and normalizing conflict. Now let me turn to another current example, and that's the case of Hungary. And here we're talking about Christian. The overt governmental persecution of minority religions and the intercommunal violence that marks religious nationalism in India is really not on display. Hungary, for example, is not on USERF's lists of bad countries around the world. It's not on our list of countries of particular concern. The State Department doesn't include it in its special watch list for these kinds of issues. Yet Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his utterly dominant Fidesz party openly embrace and promote Christian nations. Incidents of tension with minority religions are rising, as are examples of discriminatory governmental policies, including harassment aimed at institutions and individuals belonging to minority faiths. These, both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bias, have risen as well. The politics of Hungary over the last 2 decades has been defined by a number of obvious concerns that should be considered to understand what's occurring. Foremost among these is the migration crisis that is impacting so much of Europe. Successive events in the Middle East since the Gulf Wars have driven millions of mostly Muslim refugees to seek security and a better life in Europe. Likewise, climate change and regional violence in North Africa and the Sahel are also inclining a large number of, again, mostly Muslim migrants toward Europe. Even relatively welcoming countries such as Germany and Sweden have seen their politics roiled by this influx of migration. And while Hungary has not been especially impacted by large numbers of refugees, in fact, it's one of the countries that gets the fewest numbers, Hungarian right-wing parties adopted a hard-line stance from the very beginning against this influx. and against Muslim refugees themselves, pushing policies that blocked and expelled many, and even that targeted legally admitted migrants for discrimination. Another factor to consider here is a suspicion of liberal secular values and institutions in rural areas of the country, among the working class and among pensioners. Politically, this manifests as hostility toward the EU's support for diversity, such as gay rights, gun policies. Some, I suspect that this suspicion is lingering nostalgia for the presumed stability of things before the fall of the Iron Curtain. But there are current realities that may inform that suspicion too. There's high youth unemployment. There's a widening income gap. Smokestack industries in Hungary are struggling to compete in the global economy. And there's anxiety on the part of pensioners regarding the state's ability to continue to provide what we would call social security and Medicare. Finally, anti-Semitism has an ancient history that in some ways has been unleashed in recent years. We should not forget that Hungary was allied with Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy before and during the Second World War. Its troops fought alongside the Wehrmacht in a number of theaters. In the 1930s, Hungary passed anti-Jewish laws that were directly inspired by similar measures in Germany. Indeed, Hungarian authorities ultimately sent nearly 500,000 Jews to Hitler's death camps. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, anti-Semitism reemerged in it. Over the last decade and a half, anti-Semitism has also been normalized publicly. Right-wing extremists and neo-Nazi gatherings attract large audiences in public events. There are reports of Jewish cemeteries being vandalized, and prominent Jews have reported harassment. George Soros is regularly a punching bag in the state-controlled media as a representative of an alleged international Jewish conspiracy. The Anti-Defamation League, in fact, identifies Hungary today as the most anti-Semitic country in Europe, with more than 40% of its population reporting some level of anti-Semitic view. With these factors as context, now let me turn specifically to the Christian nationalism of Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party. Coming to power first in 2010, it's unclear precisely when the features of Orban's Christian nationalism actually gelled. However, in 2012, the preamble to Hungary's constitution was amended under Fidesz control to declare that Hungary was founded as part of Christian Europe, and that Christianity was essential for preserving its nation. In 2015, the Orban government passed stringent laws designed to limit asylum for Muslim refugees, and they built a border fence that blocked it. At the same time, Orban declared proudly that Hungary was not liberal, but was instead, and I'm quoting his term here, an illiberal democracy. And he criticized what he called, and again I quote, multiculturalism, which he defined as the coexistence of Islam, Asian religions, and Christianity. He goes on to say, and I'm quoting from him here again, we will do everything possible to spare Hungary from that. In 2019, he stated, and again I quote, the essence of illiberal democracy is Christian liberty and the protection of Christian liberty. Additional constitutional revisions in 2018 and 2020 celebrated Hungary as a Christian nation and obligated all government agencies to promote Christian culture. In 2022, a couple of years ago, in the wake of an uproar following his remarks criticizing race mixing, Orban, of all places at a convention in Texas, called for Christian nationalists in Europe and the United States to unite our forces and to defend the fundamental values of Christian civilization. Arguably, Orban and the Fidesz leadership found Christian nationalism to be an effective political appeal amidst Hungarian identity politics. They used it to baptize their anti-Muslim immigration policy. Such Christian nationalism seems to invoke an almost tribal identity of us versus them, and suspicion of anything that is different or other. Far from advancing solidarity, in other words, the weaponization of Christianity in Hungary has been primarily used to stoke, to sharpen, and to use social divisions. Western secularism, Jews, Muslims, and other minority groups, like Scientologists and small Protestant denominations, all these have been demonized. The religious nationalism of Hungary, we see the generation of divisiveness that is eerily similar to what Hindutva generates in India. So, with these cases, that's the end of the empirical part of my talk. I hope I've demonstrated how efforts to impose a singular religious identity in places like Hungary, India, and Myanmar have resulted in sharpened, fomented division, polarization, and internal conflict. But I want you to note what's common about these cases. First
Just
of all,
like old times.
yeah, just like old times. First, I want you to note that this nationalism, this religious nationalism is opposed from the top down. Second, I want you to note that it's fundamentally unitary, meaning they don't want differences within. Third, I want you to note that it sets up an us versus them attitude. Fourth, I want you to note that it's achieved by the imposition of power. And lastly, I want you to note that this way of imagining solidarity is that it's one that is closed in on itself. Yeah, I see a hand in the back.
I wanted to, this is maybe more of a technical question, but, that you might have more of a, there's already been like a pretty long tradition of Christian democracy in Europe. How would you say that I believe Angela Merkel was part of Germany's Christian Democratic Party, which has been a prominent part of German politics for a long time now. How exactly does that kind of politics, this sort of like Christian democracy
Right.
fit into this
Right. Yeah.
this type of-
Obviously, I want to distinguish the Christian democracy and Christian socialist movements of people like Konrad Adenauer from the kind of Christian nationalism that's being considered in these cases and different from the religious nationalism generally that we see in places like Myanmar, India, and Hungary. But I think that to get to that point, let me go to the rest of my talk, because remember, the focus here is solidarity. So,
We will take questions at the end, so I encourage you already to be thinking about what you'd like to ask our guest.
yeah, those case studies that I just led you through have led me to think very differently about the Catholic social magisterium's precept of solidarity. And while I don't have time or the references at my fingertips, let me note here that on the theoretical side, I'm much influenced by philosophers like Charles Taylor and Michael Sandel. My first point, remember I'm on the theoretical side. My first point, discerned from the cases that I've just marched, is that solidarity cannot be pushed or even legitimated from above. There are two parts to this. Broad solidarity must emerge from informal social structures, informal social associations below, and not from some formal authority. The church's social doctrine teaching on subsidiarity, for example, speaks precisely to this. Additionally, I don't think that genuine solidarity can be intentionally crafted according to some plan. I'm not even sure that it can be legitimate by an above authority without sacrificing its legitimacy. And needless to say, real solidarity cannot be weaponized for a social, religious, or political purpose. My second insight, which is closely related to the first, is that solidarity cannot be imposed or cemented by power. And although many traditional theories of solidarity present it as able to work within a hierarchy of power relations, I see from the examples that I've just listed that inequalities in power look to be fundamentally destabilizing for real solidarity. Toward equality rather than disparities. The third point is that solidarity cannot be closed or oppositional. It cannot be tribal. By this, I mean it cannot proceed from an us versus them, or to use the language of Carl Schmitt, a friend-enemy worldview, one that validates only what is tribal or internal, and therefore one that resents, opposes, or is suspicious of what is external. Inevitably, such worldviews objectify what is different. And when they do that, inevitably, they circle back onto themselves. They come back to objectify themselves. In objectifying the other, they objectify themselves at the same time. I see genuine solidarity as engaging with the world in a dialogical or even a synodal fashion. In other words, true to its identity, but willing to receive and learn and grow from what is outside its identity. My conclusion, then, is that solidarity is possible only in pluralism. It can be achieved only by accompaniment of differences, not by overcoming or subjugating. To return to my empirical experience, it's in their efforts to sweep away or eliminate differences that marks the failure of solidarity in the religious nationalisms of Myanmar, India, and Hungary. In fact, I'd go so far to say that along these lines, that something like, remember, I'm kind of regretting this is going to be on YouTube, something like harmonious accompaniment is essential, is the essential definition of solidarity. So for the reasons that I've mentioned then, real solidarity is going to be different. It's going to come from below. It's going to not be intentional. It's not going to come from an imposition of power. It's not oppositional. It's not closed in on itself. It's pluralist. And it's dialogical. Well, that's my talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. So here's how we'll proceed. I'm going to take my prerogative as a moderator and put a couple of questions to you myself to open things up. And then we'll open things up to the audience after that. I do want to remind you or inform you, if you don't already know about it, that the next event in our series will be another discussion of solidarity under the title, The Virtue of Solidarity. And we'll be speaking, this will be an online webinar event with several contributing authors to a recent book by Oxford University Press called a virtue, the virtue of solidarity. We'll have scholars from King's College London, Andrea San Giovanni, St. John's University, Megan Clark, the University of Louisville, Avery Kohlers, and University of Pennsylvania, Sally Schultz. You're all warmly invited to that event.
We could talk with Megan and St. John's next week, actually.
Oh, how about that? Well, she is the Catholic Solidarity person. So, first of all, let's go back to this topic of religious nationalism and think about it for a moment. There's something that sounds almost paradoxical about the idea of Buddhist nationalism, or indeed Christian nationalism. Christianity is a universal. I mean, the thrust of it is toward inclusion and evangelization. So what in your understanding is religious nationalism? What animates it? The seemingly paradoxical notion.
Yeah. Well, I think you're leading me on with the question because, of course, I don't think that there's anything ultimately Christian or Buddhist or Hindu about Hindu nationalism, Buddhist nationalism, and Christian nationalism. These are primarily political movements that are turning religion into a kind of weapon, to use a term that I talked about a couple of times, as a kind of weapon for achieving political power. And and in that regard, I don't think they're very reflective of the real religions that are.
Well, if that's the case, then is this really a religious problem, or is it more of a political problem? In other words, is the problem less with the religious in religious nationalism and more with nationalism itself? And I ask you this as the author of a book on cosmopolitical vision.
It's both, to be honest with you.
Mhm.
It's clearly a political problem. It's one of the dominant political problems that we see around the world today. In fact, as I just as I heard from the introduction, my day job around the world is to monitor religious freedom. One of the greatest threats to religious freedom around the world today is it's a political problem in essence. It's confronting and opposing the rights of conscience, the rights of belief, the rights of faith, or not to believe in countries around the world. So it's a political problem in that regard. And it's a political problem in regards to its engagement in political parties to seize government control and so forth. But at the same time, it is a religious problem. I think religions themselves suffer as a result of efforts to nationalize. I think it hurts Christianity when it's converted into Christian nations or seen through the lens of Christianity. I think that it's the same thing that you should with this movement. Religion suffers to the extent that it becomes harnessed into political movements.
A couple more things for you. First of all, religious freedom. You've talked mainly about really violations of religion, forms of religious persecution, for example. What, in a positive sense, in your view, does religious freedom, does a kind of constructive regime of religious freedom look like? And I'm going to assume that that's different from Christian freedom or Christian liberty that you mentioned in your talk.
Yeah. Well, religious freedom, in my estimation, is, as I said at the beginning, is in some sense, it's the canary in the coal mine for the measure of the health of human rights generally and democracy more broadly within a country. And so you'll see, and I've seen this firsthand as I've gone around the world, in places where freedom of religion is at risk, there's almost automatically a rise in authoritarianism. With authoritarianism comes the jeopardizing of a whole host of rights. And obviously authoritarianism is fundamentally contrary to the whole idea of democracy. So, religious liberty is kind of the gateway right, or some people would call it the anchor right, on which really all of the rest of the rights that we value so highly.
Now, you couched part of your talk in terms of Catholic social teaching about ideas like subsidiarity and solidarity. Is religious freedom another Catholic idea or an idea that Catholic social theory affirms? And how does it relate to those other values that you mentioned, solidarity?
It's absolutely affirmed in Catholic social teachings. The famous encyclical Dignitatis Humanae, which came out at about the time of Vatican II, enshrines it within the Church's social magisterium. And so it's something that all Catholics have to believe in and practice it during their faith. How's that?
Fine. Now, I can't help asking you a question as a fellow political theorist about your schema here regarding solidarity. Specifically, it seems to me that in a sense, solidarity does have to be closed, much in the same way that, when we talk about the common good, you can't have a common good unless there's a certain group to which it is common. And it seems like solidarity has to be bounded in some sense. So I wonder if you would want to modify this idea that solidarity can't be closed in order to expand what you mean when you say it can't be closed in on itself.
Yeah, I want to be really careful here because I don't want us to understand solidarity in terms of having some kind of boundary around it. I don't like that idea. If I could give the folks here a metaphor, solidarity in the way that I'm thinking about it is kind of like the vinaigrette in a good tossed salad. It embraces the distinctiveness of each of the ingredients in the salad while at the same time lifting them up. And so there's no edge on the outside. There's no boundary. Instead, it's something within.
Inherently inclusive. All right. Well, thank you very much for that. Let's open things up to the audience. Adrian?
I enjoyed your presentation. It was very clear, and I think it's a topic that should be discussed. So thank you. And from that, I want to ask, do you think there is an ideological crisis, religious, or do you think that there is some learned or something more at root within the species itself, let's say biological, where that the species appearing in the arena with the other finds a hostility, and that hostility can't be rooted out? Do you think there's something within us that has this? But second, either in your spectrum of top up or top down on this hemispheres, how do you rid yourself of the dialectical oppositionality that occurs just normally within these two opposing characters?
Well, let me deal with it first. Yes, you're asking anthropological species that's in there. And I think, if we look at the earliest forms of human society, clearly there's a tribal organization, but I don't think that we should be limited, by what our anthropological roots look like. I think that we need to, in fact, I think in this particular regard, it's much better for us to try to move beyond that. To the extent that's a real. In regards to your second, the oppositional, I think that I want to look at the. I don't want this to imagine this to be something like a mark. Okay? I don't see the relationships within pluralism to be kind of a market like that. And instead, as I said, I prefer to think of it in terms of a dialogue in which there isn't conflict necessarily, but at the same time, in a real dialogue, both sides can learn and grow and add to what they currently. I prefer to think of it that way. I realize that that's aspirational, but what's the famous line from Browning? Man's reach should extend his grasp for what's ahead before. Let's be aspirational.
Thank you so much for this talk. I definitely enjoyed it. I'm very passionate about religious liberty as well, so I have been thinking about a question for that, so I hope that I worded it correctly. I know that religions like influence your morals and how you look at life and like policy. So to a certain extent, just like in the government, you use your religion to advocate for certain policies, but it's just like your moral standpoint, like how you do it. But in countries like France, for example, I'm pretty positive that they have it so that they don't want religion to be in the government. Make it so that you don't require one faith or the other. Like to what extent should like countries that advocate for the government without permission of what, or do you have an example of a country that like executes pluralism and religion?
So, really good question. So obviously, I'm trying to find a place in between a militant secularism, such as you see in France's laïcité, and religious nationalism. I mean, I would argue that these are kind of poles, and in both of these poles, freedom of religion loses. Freedom of religion, you know, in a sense, needs to find a place between laïcité and that's kind of what I'm trying to. That's a really good you know, I worked in the White House Faith-Based Council for Religion and Neighborhood Partners. Yeah, I'm you know, now working for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. So, you know, I believe that government can work with religion, but I think that the relationship needs to be one of partnership. I don't think government should be actively involved in trying to help promote religion.
In back,
Um, on that information to governance tends to sometimes you so even though I agree with you that they are top down and there does also seem strong cases. And that's about that's complicated. That's hard to sort of top down.
It does complicate it, Julia. You're right. It's a bit more fuzzy than I'm presenting it here in this theoretical model. In reality, is, as you say, there is strong social media presence that, you know, is at work in Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar and is certainly evident in India. I should say, I probably get about a dozen emails a day from people in India who are calling me to be shuttered in one fashion or another. So, you know, there's clearly a strong kind of presence in social media. However, I would say that in both of those two instances, there's also the complicity of government in that social media. So government is creating a space and in some cases actually promoting Hindutva in India and particularly the way I'm presenting it here, and Buddhist nationalism. So while there is some degree of bottom up going on there, at the same time, it's government that's creating and encouraging a great deal of that social media. Yeah.
Yeah, Steve, so I want to follow up from Julie's question, because I was thinking along the same lines. I don't know either country very well. You mentioned a little bit about Hungary, and you also referred a little bit to Hungary's history of anti-Semitism. And I was also thinking about their long history of conflict with the Ottoman Empire. And so my question is, to what extent are these examples that you gave potentially replicable anywhere? That we could see this in any country, and to what extent do you think it's because of pre-existing cultural values, things in society or histories that make it more likely to see the emergence of religious nationalism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the difference between the theoretical model and the critical cases. So, yeah, Hungary, because of its particular history, struggle with the Ottoman Empire, its long history of anti-Semitism, in a sense, already had historical conditions that made the appeal of Christian nationalism in Hungary a little easier. It found more fertile ground to grow there. And I would say that the same thing is true in India, but for different reasons. I think the partition of India after World War II and the creation of Pakistan and then later Bangladesh and so forth created some historical conditions in which Muslims were objectified and viewed as villains, pretty early on as a result of the collapse of colonialism. So I recognize that that's true. So I do think that certain historical conditions are really and a more fertile, less fertile grounds for this religious nationalism to occur. But at the same time, I think that that anywhere that there's religion, there's the possibility of it being abused in this particular, maybe not as effectively as it has been abused in the cases. Good question. Yes. What do we, I'm sorry.
You have to partner. I know you said that. You said like the government should.
We're a government agency, but we rely on groups like, well, I had a meeting with Catholic Relief Services about 2 weeks ago where we learned about conditions in Central Africa that are impacting religious freedom issues there. And so we view them as, the same thing, HIAS, which is a Jewish organization, we work with in regard to Afghan situation. So we partner with them for information. They bring things to our attention so that we can act on them and include them in. Yes, sister.
Can't help but ask this question. There is a movement towards Christian nationalism in this country. You talked about other countries. Can you comment on the movement towards Christian nationalism in our own country?
Well, I could comment on it, but I don't know how much trouble I want to get into here. It's the same concerns that I have about religious nationalism in Hungary and India and Myanmar. They would be to have concerns about Christian nationalism. So I view it as problematic, both for American politics to the extent that it becomes established, but also I view it as problematic for our Christian faith itself. I think that it turns our faith into something that it's for both those reasons. I guess I personally, I'm speaking again in my personal capacity, I personally have issues with it.
Sophie?
So. And the second one is, I find it's true. Christian, but it's very important. The Syria is in like the previous government. In the beginning of this. My second question. I've seen English is so hard. It depends. Obviously, we still need differently, I guess you could say. What are your thoughts on that? And, you know, I know you talk about a pluralist, like, understanding of it, but how are you supposed to protect the country who's supposed to have language, borders, and culture, something that does not agree with that country that's coming in?
Something personally about Syria. Previous government, the dictatorship of the previous government was horrible. It was engaged in long-standing attacks on its own citizens. Not essentially no human rights for the most part under that government. For the group that has taken over Syria and overthrown the previous government, usually identified with the letters HTS, was formally associated with ISIS and brings with it particular kind of Muslim nationalism that, at least currently, is raising all sorts of alarms. You see the attack on the Alawite community that's occurring there. I would argue that the attack is essentially based on ethnicity rather than religion, but nevertheless, it's very concerning. I think the situation in Syria is still unfolding, and it's probably too soon to guess exactly where it's going to land. But you know, if I were the president of the United States, which I'm not, I would be doing quite a bit more to oppose and to rein in the HTS officials that are currently in the situation in Syria. And I'm very worried that it's what we're going to see there is the opening up of a larger civil war again. So very concerned about the situation there. It's all because it's so, because it's in the middle of a conflict and it's unfolding right now. I don't think that we can really even all about where you were going with the Palestine question. Give me a little bit more to go on there.
Okay. But I think things like New York, just great.
Cross.
It's not how it coincides with the terms of the data system.
Well, I have to say I have a hard time understanding some of the demonstrations that have occurred, not just in New York, but other parts. And that said, you know, given where I am in the argument that I believe, I think that there is Christians and Jews and Muslims can live together in the same country quite cooperatively and productively. So I don't see any concerns.
So I do agree that, I mean, nobody should be punished for what religion they follow or no prison time, no financial punishment, stuff like that. But as a Catholic, and there's millions of Catholics in this country, how does one then balance this idea of pluralism, which to me is a red flag in itself? Also, Christian nationalism also gives off a red flag. But how does one balance this solidarity without compromising the Catholic faith? Because in the Catechism, we're instructed that although some of these faiths may have truths within them, at the end of the day, they're deceived by the evil one. They lack the truth, and we're called to bring them through grace, bring them into the church by the grace of Christ. So how is it that we can affirm Christ as the only path to salvation, the ultimate truth, while also trying to have these respectful dialogues?
One of my favorite memories from John Paul's second is Oscars. It's awesome.
Your description of religious nationalism, top down, within on itself, unitary, us versus them. It strikes me as almost the same as the canonization of orthodoxy, defined against some kind of heretical or splinter group. So what's the difference? Are all orthodoxies originally a form of religious nationalism? Or is there a distinction to be made?
Okay. I mean, I think orthodoxy that's closed in on itself, and that is not open to the world, not willing to engage. And I think that fundamentally, all kinds of evangelical engagement in the world have to be open to the world, cannot be closed in on itself. So I think if we define orthodoxy as closed, as inward looking, as having a boundary beyond which you're not allowed to cross, as being closed to the kind of dialogical relationship with the outside world that I've been describing, I would have problems with that understanding. But it's just me.
Thank you for the presentation. I am Asma Hussein. I'm from Indonesia. So you talk about liberal democracy and human rights in a way the foundation for international based order. I would like to refer to the earlier talk about Gaza. This is a difficult question because when you talk about these two issues, human rights and liberal democracy, people in the global south seeing the treatment, the human rights and the democracy of the Gazans. And they say, this is, I'm quoting them, but this is based on what is happening. This shows the destruction of international based order because their human rights are not equal to the rights of others, either in the West or in the East, it doesn't matter. So what your response would be to those in the global South who state that because the human rights of Palestinians are not equal to the rest, what answer do we give them? Yeah. I know it's a difficult question, but I think it's a good one to address.
It's a difficult question for me to answer because it's kind of outside my area, but I think, I mean, the reality is that governments around the world throughout history have been hypocritical. And I think the international order sometimes is still filled with that same kind of hypocritical attitude. And so I would agree with those in the global South, but not only in the incident that you mentioned here, but in number of instances around the world, conflicts around the world, we see the international order that's proudly holds up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the gold standard by which all countries are to behave. We see over and over again countries falling short of that. But I want to go back to the argument that I made in response to your neighbor's question before. I think the aspirational quality of that Universal Declaration of Human Rights is still fundamentally important. Yes, we don't live up to it. I absolutely agree. Over and over again, we fall short of it. But nevertheless, that's what we should all be aiming for.
and you all, also are. Feel myself alive.
I should have turned to you to answer that question, by the way.
Training. Yeah. That's the friend of that being typical for County City. She's talking about the gifts that come in that exchange, the gifts that are inherently pluralism from our distinct human dignity, different cultural traditions.
It's a terrific question. Do all of you guys know the encyclical Fratelli Tutti? I need to introduce it. Well, Fratelli Tutti is in a sense about self. It's about the necessity of creating a kind of fraternity, brotherhood and a sisterhood among us, out of which a better kind of politics, one of the chapters, chapter 5, a better kind of politics can. And honestly, I wasn't thinking of Fratelli Tutti, but this is a lot like Fratelli Tutti. So there's a wonderful vignette, and I would argue the best gloss ever on the story of the Good Samaritan at the beginning of Fratelli Tutti. If you've not read the encyclical, maybe read that the part about the Good Samaritan. And the way that Pope Francis elucidates, glosses over shows that we should think of ourselves as every single character in that parable. We are the victim, we are the persecutor, we are the priest that walks by, we are all of those sorts of things. And we need to recognize that we are all of those sorts of things in that kind of pluralist way to really kind of create, establish the kind of fraternity, the brotherhood and the sisterhood that Fratelli Tutti is about. And yeah, I would say that, maybe I was influenced by Pope Francis and didn't even know it.
Right, well, I think we're going to conclude on that very nice note, so let's.
Appreciate it.
You're always welcome.
Thank you.